When he handed me a folded towel without looking at me, I noticed his fingertips brushing mine. It was a small thing, barely a second, but something inside me shifted, like a fault line deep under the surface. I told myself it was nothing. That I was imagining it. That I had simply forgotten how to receive attention, and that any gesture felt like more than it really was. But when I turned to walk back into the bathroom, I felt his gaze follow me. Not the polite, familial glance of a young man toward his elder. No, this gaze lingered, aware and quiet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning over in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady breath of my husband beside me. That breath had once meant safety, routine, belonging. Now it sounded like absence. Like distance. And I lay there, wondering what had begun inside of me. Wondering how a stranger's eyes could make me feel more seen than the man who once promised me forever. But before I explain what happened, what really happened, you have to understand the silence that lived in our home long before he arrived. Let me tell you everything from the beginning, before judgment, before conclusions. And while I open this door, I ask you one thing: have you ever felt invisible in your own life? It started simply. Not with glances or longing, not with temptation, but with routine. My husband's grandson from a previous marriage, well, not grandson by blood, but he called him that, had asked to stay with us for a few weeks while settling into the city for university. He was polite in the message, formal even. If it's not too much trouble, he wrote. I remember reading it aloud in the kitchen, my husband grunting something that meant yes without really engaging. That was his way lately. With everything. He arrived with one bag and a backpack. I opened the door and immediately noticed the smell of the street on him, cool air, faint laundry detergent, the leather of his bag. He smiled easily, thanked me twice. I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone young smiled at me like that. Not flirtatiously. Just present. My husband helped carry the bag, muttering something about traffic. I offered tea. That's what I do, offer things. Offer space. Offer food. Offer silence. For most of my marriage, I had believed that keeping everything peaceful was the same as being loved. The guest room was small but warm. I had spent the afternoon changing the sheets, fluffing the pillows, putting a clean towel by the door. As I showed him around, I noticed how tall he had grown since I'd last seen him, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, at some family event where we barely exchanged words. Now he stood in the hallway with his hands in his pockets, nodding, grateful, a little shy. He thanked me again. That night, we ate dinner together, roast chicken, salad, and wine my husband opened without ceremony. The conversation was easy, mostly small talk. My husband spoke in short bursts, asking about the city, the university. I asked more than I needed to, probably. I wanted to make him comfortable. He seemed surprised when I remembered what he had planned to study. Psychology, I think. Or maybe design. I was surprised that I had remembered too. After dinner, the men disappeared into the living room. I stayed behind to clean. That's what I do, stay behind. But as I stood at the sink, I heard laughter. Not just from him, but from my husband. A full, chest-deep laugh I hadn't heard in months. It was short-lived, but I paused, dish in hand, and listened. And for a moment, I was jealous. Of laughter. Of connection. The next morning, I noticed myself brushing my hair a little longer than usual. I chose a blouse I hadn't worn in months, not low-cut, nothing inappropriate, but softer somehow. Flowing. I applied a light gloss to my lips and immediately wiped it off. What was I doing? Still, I kept the blouse. Over the next few days, he made himself at home gently, without intrusion. He kept his room neat, made tea for himself, offered to help in the kitchen. He asked me questions, small things at first, like where the coffee filters were, then bigger things, how I liked living here, what I used to do before retiring. I told him stories I hadn't told in years. I heard myself laugh in ways I didn't recognize. My husband remained distant. Even with someone else in the house, his pattern didn't change. Mornings with his paper and instant coffee. Afternoons tinkering in the shed. Evenings in front of the television. We sat beside each other, day after day, and somehow grew farther apart with every shared silence. I didn't resent him, not really. That was the strangest part. I had simply learned to adapt. Like a plant turning toward a different source of light when the sun shifted. One afternoon, the young man came home early from his orientation. I was in the garden, pruning dead leaves. He stepped onto the patio and asked if I needed help. I said no, but he stayed anyway. We worked side by side for 20 minutes, not speaking. It wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, the silence felt charged. Not romantic, not yet, but aware. As if both of us knew we had crossed an invisible line without meaning to. Later that evening, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. Sun-kissed cheeks, bits of soil under my nails, lips slightly parted. I didn't look young. But I looked alive. That night, I lay in bed wide awake. I listened to the creaks of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant echo of a car outside. I turned onto my side and studied the back of my husband's shoulder. His breath moved slowly, rhythmically, but I felt no warmth from him. Just the sound. I whispered into the darkness, not knowing who I was speaking to. Maybe myself. Maybe no one. Do you even see me anymore? There was no answer. There hadn't been for a long time. But now someone else had. And I wasn't sure if that made me terrified or thrilled. It was just past midnight when I heard the creak of the floorboards outside the bedroom door. I had been awake, not quite tossing, not quite resting, just lying there in the stillness. My husband's breathing had already slowed into that familiar rhythm of sleep, but mine remained restless, shallow. The hallway light was on, casting a soft golden hue under the crack of the door, and I could hear the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, it felt suspended. I slid out of bed, not bothering to put on my robe. The house was warm, the air still carrying the scent of whatever herbs I had been cutting earlier in the garden. As I stepped into the hallway, I hesitated for a moment. Then I walked toward the kitchen. He stood there barefoot, shirtless, drinking water straight from a glass in his hand. The fridge door was still ajar, casting a faint blue light on his face and shoulders. He turned slightly when he heard my steps, not startled, just aware. I stopped near the counter, arms crossed loosely, trying to appear casual though my pulse betrayed me. I couldn't sleep, I said softly, barely above a whisper. He nodded, taking another sip before setting the glass down carefully on the counter. Me neither, he replied, his voice low and calm. There was nothing unusual about the words. And yet, everything about the moment felt unusual. The kitchen had never felt this quiet, this heavy with anticipation. I opened a drawer, rummaged around just to give my hands something to do, and pulled out a tea bag. He watched me, not intrusively, just attentively, like someone observing a painting in progress. Chamomile? I offered, lifting the box. He smiled faintly. Sure. I busied myself with the kettle, filling it slowly, aware of his presence just a few feet away. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't awkward. It was something else. Measured. Intentional. When the water boiled, I poured it into 2 mismatched mugs and handed one to him. His fingers brushed mine. That was the first moment. He didn't pull away quickly, and neither did I. It was such a fleeting thing, a light contact, but it resonated like a note plucked on a tightly wound string inside my chest. I turned and leaned against the counter, sipping my tea to occupy my mouth, my thoughts, my nerves. He mirrored me, standing on the opposite side, and for a while, we drank in silence. He was the one who broke it. "It's peaceful here," he said. "Too peaceful, sometimes," I replied before I could stop myself. His eyes flicked to mine. "I know what you mean." I didn't answer. Instead, I looked down at the steam rising from my mug. The heat wasn't the reason my cheeks burned. I was wearing a light cotton sleep shirt that brushed just below my knees. Nothing revealing. Nothing intentional. And yet, I suddenly felt bare. Not in a physical sense, but seen. Exposed in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. He set his mug down and leaned slightly forward, elbows on the countertop. "You seem different lately," he said. "Different how?" I asked too quickly. He shrugged. "Just. I don't know. You smile more. But it's not always a happy smile." I looked at him then, directly. Something in his voice had shifted, gentle, but searching. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't mockery. It was observation, stripped of pretense. I wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off, but the truth of his words settled uncomfortably in my chest. "I've been thinking a lot lately," I said. "About who I used to be. And who I've become." His expression softened, and he said nothing, which somehow made the moment feel heavier. There was nothing romantic in his gaze. But it wasn't neutral either. The tea had gone cold. I placed my mug on the counter and turned toward the hallway. "I should probably get back to bed," I said, though I didn't move immediately. He nodded, stepping aside as if to let me pass, but when I did, our bodies were close. Closer than they needed to be. I felt the air change. Not temperature, texture. Something electric, a kind of current that neither of us had chosen but both felt. I paused. He did too. And then, we kissed. It was brief. Silent. No fireworks. No music swelling in the background. Just a quiet crossing of an invisible line that had been there the whole time, waiting. When it ended, we both stood still for a second too long. My breath was shallow. His hands were still at his sides. No one moved. I walked away first. Down the hall, back into my bedroom, into the cool sheets beside a husband who had no idea that the foundation of our home had just shifted, even if only slightly. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling 100 things at once: shame, excitement, fear, disbelief. And under it all, clarity. A sharp, ringing awareness that nothing would be the same now. Not because something grand had happened, but because a door, once closed, had quietly opened. And I had stepped through it. The next morning arrived with a strange weight in my chest, like the remnants of a dream I hadn't fully shaken off. The house was still quiet when I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my husband. He stirred faintly, rolled onto his side, and settled again into a deeper sleep. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at him. His face was peaceful, relaxed. He had no idea. Or maybe he did. It was hard to tell anymore. He had become so skilled at pretending not to notice the things that once mattered. I dressed more deliberately than usual. Nothing overt, but intentional in a way I couldn't deny. A soft sweater, jeans that fit a little better than the loose ones I usually wore around the house. I brushed my hair and added a touch of mascara before catching myself in the mirror. My reflection looked almost curious, like she was asking, "What are you doing?" I didn't have an answer. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. The teacups from the night before were gone, rinsed and placed upside down on the drying rack. I felt a ripple of unease. Had he gotten up before me just to clean them? Or had he lain awake all night too, unable to face what had happened? I moved through the morning on autopilot. Toast. Jam. A second cup of coffee. My husband eventually wandered in, yawning, muttering something about the lawn needing attention. He didn't mention anything unusual. He didn't look at me differently. If he sensed any shift, he buried it beneath layers of habitual silence. The young man didn't come down until later. When he did, he acted as if nothing had changed. Polite, relaxed, casual. He asked if there was any more coffee. I handed him the pot without speaking. For a few minutes, the air between us was filled only with clinking spoons and the occasional scrape of a chair. Then he looked at me and held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Not intense. Not inappropriate. But deliberate. It was a new kind of silence. The kind that carried too much meaning. I needed to get out of the house. I told my husband I was heading into town for errands. He didn't ask where or why, only nodded and reminded me about picking up more birdseed. I left without a clear plan, just the sudden and overwhelming urge to be somewhere else, to move, to think. The drive to the center of town felt longer than usual. I parked by the bookstore I used to frequent, though I hadn't gone inside in months. It still smelled of paper and dust, and the same man behind the counter gave me the same distracted nod as always. I wandered through the aisles aimlessly, running my fingers along the spines of books I wouldn't buy. I wasn't looking for a story. I was trying to understand my own. Eventually, I found myself in a small boutique. A display near the window caught my eye, scarves in deep jewel tones, a row of delicate earrings, a rack of dresses in soft, flowing fabrics. I hesitated before reaching out. The saleswoman approached with a practiced smile and asked if I needed help. No, I said, then paused. Actually, maybe. I'm looking for something new. She tilted her head slightly, then pulled out a wrap in a deep crimson shade. This one's special, she said. I didn't know if she meant the color or the fabric or the design, but I nodded and took it. I bought it without trying it on. The act felt symbolic. Not indulgent. Not reckless. Just necessary. I sat in my car for a while after that, the new scarf draped over the passenger seat. I stared out the windshield, not really seeing the people walking past. In my mind, I replayed the moment in the kitchen again and again. Not the kiss itself, but the silence after. The way we both stood there, unsure of what had been awakened. And what to do about it. By the time I returned home, the sun had dipped lower in the sky. The house looked the same from the outside. Predictable. Safe. I stepped inside, hanging my bag on the usual hook, placing the birdseed on the counter as if it mattered. He wasn't in the kitchen. I found him in the backyard, sitting on the edge of the wooden steps, staring out at the garden. He heard me approach but didn't turn around. I sat beside him without saying anything. The air smelled like damp soil and old roses. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and fell silent. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was suspended again, tense, but not fragile. Eventually, he stood up and said something about needing to get some work done for school. I nodded. He didn't look at me when he walked away. That night, I stood in front of my closet for too long. I touched hangers, opened drawers, rearranged things I didn't intend to wear. My hands kept returning to the scarf. I draped it over my shoulders and looked in the mirror. The color changed me. Or perhaps it revealed something I hadn't seen in a long time. The sound of the front door closing brought me back to the moment. My husband had gone out for a walk. He did that sometimes, no explanation given or needed. I stood alone in the hallway for a moment, then slowly made my way to the living room. He was there, sitting on the couch, reading something on his phone. He looked up briefly, nodded, then returned to the screen. I sat in the chair across from him and picked up a magazine. Neither of us spoke. The distance between us had never felt more pronounced. And yet, I couldn't fully name the emotion rising in my chest. Guilt? Excitement? Sadness? All of it, maybe. And something else too, a sense of crossing into unfamiliar territory, of choices made quietly and consequences that hadn't yet arrived. Later that night, I stood at the bathroom sink brushing my teeth when I heard his footsteps in the hallway again. Not my husband's, his. The younger one. He passed by the open doorway, and for the briefest second, we locked eyes. It was nothing. And it was everything. I closed the door and exhaled slowly. Nothing had happened since that night in the kitchen. And yet, everything had already changed. Days began folding into each other, soft and indistinct, like the edges of well-worn linen. I moved through them with a rhythm that was careful but not natural, as though I were mimicking a version of myself I wasn't sure I remembered how to be. In public spaces of the house, kitchen, living room, garden, I played my role seamlessly, the accommodating hostess, the steady wife, the keeper of routines. But under the surface, I was no longer still. Something had shifted in me since that night. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in quiet, irreversible ways. I noticed it in the way my eyes followed him when he walked into a room. In how my breath changed when he spoke, even if it was just to ask where the tea towels were. And most of all, in the silences, the new ones. The ones that no longer felt empty, but full of unspoken questions neither of us had the courage to ask. My husband remained oblivious, or chose to be. He spent more and more time in the shed out back, tinkering with old radios, fixing things that weren't really broken. When we did share space, we rarely spoke more than necessary. I'd ask if he wanted coffee, he'd grunt in reply. I'd mention the weather, he'd nod. But he never asked how I was. Never noticed the small things, the new scarf I wore, the way I lingered by the window, the pause in my voice when I said goodnight. One morning, I woke early. The sky outside was still gray, the kind of overcast that made time feel suspended. I stepped into the hallway and found myself listening, no particular reason, just instinct. I heard movement in the kitchen. Not hurried, not loud. Just the soft clink of a spoon, the quiet hum of someone existing before the house woke up. I walked in and found him there, sitting at the table with a notebook open, coffee in hand. He looked up, surprised but not startled, and offered a small smile. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said. "You didn't," I replied, pulling the cardigan around my shoulders. "I just couldn't sleep." I moved around the kitchen slowly, almost ritualistically, boiling water, choosing a mug, opening the drawer that always stuck halfway. He didn't say anything more, and I was grateful. Words felt too heavy at that hour. Instead, I sat across from him with my tea and looked out the window. The garden was still damp from rain the night before. The roses sagged under the weight of leftover water, their petals darkened and swollen. Something about their quiet resilience caught in my throat. We stayed like that for a while, drinking in silence. There was something sacred in it. Nothing dramatic. Just presence. Eventually, he closed his notebook and stood. "Thanks for the company," he said, voice low. "I'll get out of your way." I wanted to say something then, to ask him to stay, or at least to not disappear so quickly, but the words didn't come. Instead, I gave a slight nod, and he left the room. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the garden again. I had pulled on gloves and was cutting back the dead lavender stems, even though they could have waited. The repetition calmed me. The snip of the shears, the earthy scent rising with each motion, it gave me something to focus on that wasn't the spinning inside my head. He appeared at the edge of the patio a little while later. He didn't say anything, just watched me work for a moment before stepping forward and offering to help. I hesitated just long enough to register the way my stomach flipped at the sight of him, but then handed him the spare pair of gloves. We worked side by side in quiet coordination. I showed him how to snip near the base, how to gather the cuttings in bundles. Our arms brushed once. Then again. Neither of us acknowledged it. When we finished, we sat on the low stone wall that bordered the garden. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees, catching the dust and pollen in the air, turning it gold. He leaned back on his hands, his sleeves pushed up, the collar of his shirt opened slightly. I didn't mean to speak. The words came on their own. Do you ever feel like you've fallen asleep inside your own life? He turned his head slowly, considering the question. Yeah, he said. More than I'd like to admit. I looked at him then, and I knew he meant it. Not to flatter, not to impress. He said it the way people say things when they've stopped trying to perform. I nodded. Me too. That was the first moment I felt like someone had truly seen me in years. Not as a mother. Not as a wife. Not as a figure passing through a room. But as a person. A woman. Still living. That night, I sat at my vanity longer than usual. I brushed my hair slowly, watching myself in the mirror. My face was no longer youthful, but it wasn't without beauty. There were lines now, some from laughter, others from years of quiet. I traced them gently, as if they were stories I hadn't yet told. Behind me, the hallway light flickered on and off. Someone had passed by. I didn't turn to check. I just sat there, breathing. The hours passed with a strange tension. At dinner, the three of us ate together again. The conversation was sparse. My husband commented on a scratch on his hand, something from the workshop. I nodded, offered antiseptic from the drawer. The young man said he had some reading to do later. No one mentioned the garden. Or the morning. Or the closeness that had threaded through the day like a string neither of us wanted to tug. Afterward, I cleaned the kitchen while they both disappeared to their separate corners of the house. The act felt almost meditative. Dishes. Soap. Water. Towel. I let my hands do what my heart didn't know how to. Later, I stood outside on the porch alone. The evening was cool, a soft breeze carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke. I pulled the scarf tighter around my neck and looked up at the sky. There were no stars visible, only clouds. But I stared anyway, waiting for something. Footsteps behind me broke the quiet. I didn't mean to intrude, he said softly. You're not, I replied, still facing the trees. We stood there in silence, shoulder to shoulder but not touching. The porch creaked slightly under our weight. I could hear his breath, steady and even. Something inside me wanted to speak, to confess, to explain, to ask questions I wasn't ready to hear the answers to, but I said nothing. Sometimes silence is safer. Eventually, he turned to go. Good night, he said. I didn't answer right away. But when I did, my voice was barely above a whisper. Good night. He walked away. I stayed there for a long time, watching nothing, feeling everything. The morning air carried the scent of wet soil and fading roses. I stood by the sink, hands resting on the counter, watching the soft drizzle fall onto the garden outside. The house was quiet. My husband had left early to pick up parts for something he was repairing, an old clock, I think. He hadn't asked if I wanted to come. He never did. I moved through the kitchen slowly, rinsing the breakfast dishes one by one, not because I was in a hurry to finish, but because the small motions gave me something to hold on to. Routine had become my disguise. Within it, I could feel everything and nothing all at once. He came downstairs sometime after 10. I heard his footsteps descending slowly, then a pause at the bottom step before he entered the kitchen. I didn't turn around immediately. I kept drying the plate in my hands until I felt his presence behind me. He didn't speak at first. The silence pressed against my back like a question I wasn't ready to answer. "Morning," he said eventually, his voice quieter than usual. I turned and offered a faint nod, brushing a damp strand of hair from my cheek. I wasn't wearing makeup that day. I hadn't needed it. Something in me felt too raw, too exposed to hide behind color or powder. He looked tired. Or maybe I was projecting. There were shadows under his eyes, and he stood with the kind of stillness that felt like he was holding something in. "I'm going out for a bit," I said, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Just need some air." He nodded, but he didn't move. His eyes stayed on mine longer than they should have. "Do you want company?" he asked. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want it, but because I did. I ended up saying nothing. Just stepped aside, set the towel down, and picked up my keys. We left the house together, wordless. The air was cool, the clouds above thick but not threatening. We didn't go far, just down the hill, past the grove of pines, toward the old walking path that wrapped around the reservoir. It wasn't a place for grand gestures or revelations. Just a quiet path with soft earth and scattered leaves and the sound of wind skimming water. We walked slowly. Not quite side by side, not quite apart. A distance kept deliberately uneven. It took me some time to realize we weren't really walking anywhere. Just circling something unnamed. The quiet between us felt denser than usual, and every now and then, I'd glance at him and catch his gaze already there, soft but unreadable. Near the edge of the water, I sat on a bench that faced the trees. He sat beside me without asking. We didn't speak. I think we both knew that if we said too much, it might unravel whatever fragile thing was stretching between us. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers laced. I sat upright, hands in my lap, thumb brushing the corner of my palm in a slow, unconscious rhythm. After a long silence, he exhaled. "I don't know what's happening," he said, barely above the wind. "But I know it doesn't feel wrong." I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how to. When I finally spoke, it was to the trees, not to him. "I don't think I've felt seen in a long time." The words surprised me, not because they weren't true, but because I hadn't meant to say them out loud. I had spent years pushing them deeper, folding them into smiles, disguising them as patience. He turned toward me, his gaze calm but full. Not expectant. Not apologetic. Just present. "I see you," he said. That should have made me flinch. But it didn't. It felt like oxygen after too long underwater. We didn't stay long after that. The wind picked up, and the clouds began to shift. On the walk back, we didn't speak, but something in the silence had changed. It felt less uncertain. Less like we were pretending nothing had happened, and more like we were preparing for what might. At home, I made tea while he disappeared upstairs. My hands trembled slightly as I set the mugs down, but I didn't spill. I waited in the kitchen longer than necessary, then eventually carried the tray to the living room, only to find it empty. He wasn't there. Neither was his tea. I paused in the hallway, listening. I could hear faint movement from upstairs. A drawer closing. A floorboard shifting. I stood there, holding the tray like a question. And then I walked up. He was in his room, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking down at his hands. He didn't seem startled when I entered. He didn't say anything. Just looked up at me and waited. I set the tea on the dresser and took a step forward. The space between us was barely a breath. He stood slowly, eyes on mine, and something passed between us, wordless, but heavy. The silence cracked, not from noise, but from recognition. I reached out, not even consciously, and touched his wrist. Just lightly. Just enough. And then, we kissed. We kissed. The moment held, suspended. Not frantic. Not stolen. Just real. When we finally pulled apart, I didn't look away. I didn't apologize. And neither did he. I stepped back, leaving my tea untouched. He didn't follow. Downstairs, I moved through the rooms as though nothing had happened. I wiped the counter, adjusted a vase, folded a towel. But every motion felt different now. Touched by something irreversible. When my husband came home an hour later, I greeted him as usual. He mentioned traffic. I nodded. He asked about dinner. I suggested something simple. There was nothing in our exchange that hinted at rupture, and yet, I felt the crack widening. That night, I lay awake long after he'd fallen asleep beside me. My body was still. My heart was not. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, brushing leaves against the windows like fingertips tracing memory. And I knew I had crossed something I couldn't uncross. Not because I had planned to. Not because I had wanted to. But because something in me had reached for life, and for a moment, it had reached back. The next morning arrived wrapped in silence, the kind that didn't feel peaceful but instead hung like a curtain between what had happened and what was yet to be said. I moved through the kitchen as usual, measured steps, quiet drawers, the familiar weight of the coffee pot in my hand, but everything in me was different. My skin still carried the memory of what had passed the day before. A single moment. A single act. A crossing. I had always believed myself to be a careful woman. One who folded linens the proper way, who knew which spices to add without measuring, who remembered birthdays without the need for a calendar. I was the keeper of peace, the organizer of lives, the one who made sure the rhythms of the house continued, even when the music had stopped. But now, I had changed something. He didn't come down for breakfast. I set the table as if he might, placing 3 plates out of habit, then removing one as if I had made a simple error. My husband ate in his usual quiet way, reading something on his phone, occasionally offering a comment about an article or a repair project. I nodded, responded where needed, but my mind drifted toward the silence upstairs, toward the conversation that hadn't happened, the one I wasn't sure either of us knew how to begin. When I finally heard movement above, my heart reacted before my thoughts did. A dull thud, the sound of feet on the floorboards, then the distinct groan of the hallway's 3rd step. I waited, pretending to read a recipe card at the counter. He came down slowly, and for a fleeting moment, our eyes met across the room. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us looked away too quickly. It was an acknowledgement, not an invitation. He grabbed an apple from the bowl and a notebook from the table before slipping out onto the back porch. I stood in the kitchen with the mug in my hand, the tea inside it already cold. All day, we orbited each other like planets that had once shared a trajectory and now didn't quite know how to realign. We stayed out of rooms the other occupied. We spoke only when necessary, choosing our words with caution. But in the few accidental moments when our hands nearly touched or our eyes met across a hallway, the space between us thickened. By late afternoon, the sky had turned heavy and low. Rain was coming. I could smell it in the air, earthy, metallic, inevitable. I stood by the window, watching the wind ripple through the trees, and felt the tension building, like something held back for too long was about to give way. Then, the front door creaked open and closed again. I heard the soft pad of shoes on wood. Not him, my husband. He walked past me without a word, heading straight for the hallway closet. I followed with my gaze, not my feet. "I'm going to the hardware store," he called over his shoulder. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "All right." He left without asking if I needed anything. He often did. And just like that, the house felt emptied of everything except what still lingered. The rain began lightly, tapping against the windows like a question. I made my way to the living room, then stopped at the threshold. He was already there, standing by the bookshelf, tracing the spines with a fingertip, though I doubted he was reading the titles. "I didn't expect anyone here," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He turned, and something in his expression made the air feel thinner. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me for a long moment before stepping back from the shelf. "I couldn't focus upstairs," he said. Neither could I. I crossed the room slowly, not toward him, but toward the window. The rain had grown stronger now, painting the glass in diagonal streaks. I watched it for a while before I realized he hadn't moved. "You okay?" he asked. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the first unfiltered thing he'd said all day. And the simplicity of it broke through something in me. "No," I said. "I'm not." He didn't rush to fill the silence. He just stood there, present. "I don't know how to be," I added. "After yesterday." He exhaled, not loudly, but like he had been holding his breath for hours. "Me neither." We didn't need to name it. The moment already knew its shape. "I don't regret it," he said, carefully. I didn't either. But the fact that I didn't terrified me more than if I had. "I should," I whispered. He didn't respond. The room felt still, but the storm outside had become stronger. Thunder murmured low in the distance, a sound that never quite arrived but reminded you it was coming. I sat down on the edge of the couch, hands folded in my lap. He stayed where he was. That was the boundary now. We both felt it. It was no longer a question of what had happened, but what would. "I don't want to cause harm," I said. "Not to him. Not to you. Not to myself." "I know." Another pause. "I don't think this is something we planned." "Of course it isn't." He walked to the armchair across from me and sat, leaving a respectful stretch of space between us. His hands rested on his knees, fingers curled inward. His gaze didn't search me, it waited. I looked down at the hem of my shirt, then out the window again. The rain blurred the world beyond into shapes and color, without definition. Like memory. Like feeling. "I used to think I had everything under control," I said. "But I think I've just been quiet for too long." "I've seen that," he replied gently. The quiet. For the first time since it had begun, I felt something like relief. Not because anything was resolved, but because the truth, small, halting, imperfect, had found its way into the room. We didn't talk about the future. We didn't make promises or threats. We didn't plan. The only thing that passed between us was presence, honest, complicated, and undeniably human. Eventually, we heard the sound of the car pulling into the driveway. My husband was home. The moment retracted into itself like a breath taken too deeply. We stood at the same time, instinctively. He walked toward the hallway, and I walked toward the kitchen. By the time the front door opened, I was pouring water into the kettle. He returned with a bag of screws and a flyer from the hardware store. I asked how the roads were. he said, wet. It was all very normal. Exceptionally normal. But beneath that quiet routine, something new had taken root. It hadn't yet grown wild. It hadn't destroyed anything. But it had changed the soil. And nothing would grow the same way again. The next day unfolded like any other, and yet nothing about it felt ordinary. I moved through the house with deliberate care, as if my footsteps might crack something delicate beneath the surface. My husband had gone to visit an old friend in a neighboring town. He mentioned it casually over breakfast, sipping his coffee, eyes fixed on the newspaper, as if the trip had been long planned. It hadn't. I would have known. When he left, the door clicked shut behind him with a finality that startled me. The silence afterward was immediate and unfamiliar. Not the kind of quiet that lingers when someone's asleep in another room. This silence felt like space, opened, expanded, waiting to be filled. I stood by the window, watching his car pull out of the drive, tires crunching over gravel. The road curled away, and the vehicle disappeared behind the bend, leaving nothing but a faint echo of movement and dust. And then I turned. The house seemed to exhale with me. I walked slowly through the downstairs rooms, brushing my fingers across familiar surfaces. Nothing had changed, and yet the air was charged, tinged with awareness. The kitchen smelled faintly of citrus and steam from the dishwasher. The dining room was still, the chairs neatly tucked in. I paused in the hallway, listening, not for danger, not for noise, but for a presence I already knew was there. He appeared on the landing above, leaning slightly against the banister, his eyes meeting mine before either of us spoke. There was no need for words. Everything necessary had already been said in silences, in glances, in the pauses between two careful conversations. Neither of us moved immediately. We held each other's gaze across the quiet, across the stairs and the polished wood and the stretch of hours we hadn't planned for but somehow both expected. I turned and walked toward the living room, hearing his footsteps follow, unhurried but certain. The space was familiar, my sanctuary, my routine, my retreat. But today, it felt different. As I stood in the center of the room, unsure whether to sit or pace or speak, I felt him stop behind me. The closeness wasn't invasive. It didn't press against me. It waited. It respected. I turned toward him, my arms crossed, not in defensiveness, but in an effort to hold something inside that was ready to spill. His expression wasn't expectant. It was open. And that was more dangerous than anything he could have said. I don't know who moved first. Maybe neither of us did. Maybe we simply allowed what was already there to find its shape. We spent the night together. That sentence stands on its own because it has to. Because it says everything and says nothing. Because the details don't matter the way the consequences do. Because what passed between us wasn't an act of conquest or escape or lust, it was something deeper, quieter, a collision of two unmet needs finding each other in a place neither of us thought to look. Afterward, I lay in the hush of early morning, the room bathed in gray light just before sunrise. He was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, facing away from me. His back was straight, hands clasped loosely between his knees. He didn't speak, and I didn't ask what he was thinking. There was a weight in the silence, but not regret. It was something heavier. Realer. I sat up, pulling the blanket around my shoulders, watching the outline of his profile. He looked older in that moment. Not in years, but in the quiet way someone looks when they realize they've crossed a threshold and there's no way back. The house remained still. The world beyond the window hadn't yet stirred. It was the kind of hour when everything feels distant, your past, your choices, even your name. And yet, I had never felt more acutely aware of myself. Of my body. Of my breath. He finally stood, slow and quiet, and turned toward me. His eyes found mine, and we exchanged the kind of look that doesn't try to explain itself. He didn't say goodbye when he left the room. He didn't need to. It wasn't the end of something. Just a return to the parts of ourselves we still had to carry alone. I remained in the room long after, letting the weight of what had happened settle into the space. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply existed in it, allowing the feeling to unfold, layer by layer. Eventually, I got up and dressed. My reflection in the mirror startled me, not because I looked different, but because I looked back. My eyes were steadier, my face less tense. There was no glow, no soft filter of newfound love. Just presence. Just truth. I walked downstairs slowly, listening to the creaks in the old wood beneath my feet. The familiar scent of the house welcomed me, and I moved into the kitchen with the same steps I always had, placing the kettle on the stove, reaching for a mug. The day stretched ahead without plans, and I knew I would fill it the way I always did, with motions, with tasks, with distractions. But something had changed. Not just between us. Inside me. I stood at the window again, holding the warm mug between my hands, watching the trees sway gently in the early breeze. The garden outside shimmered with dew. Birds moved between branches, unconcerned with the complexities of human choice. Behind me, the room was quiet. But inside me, everything was louder than it had been in years. The morning light came through the windows in soft, broken patterns, diffused by the thin curtains I hadn't replaced in years. I sat at the table with a piece of toast untouched on my plate, my fingers curled around a mug that had long since cooled. The warmth I carried from the night before had faded into something quieter, heavier. Not shame, something more complex. Not quite grief, not quite peace. A knowing, maybe. A recognition that something irreversible had settled into the bones of this house, into the walls I had once painted with careful hands, into the fabric of my days. He had left early. I heard the front door open gently, close without sound. No note, no message, no trace, just absence. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't rushed. It was considerate in a way that almost hurt more. He knew I needed space before I could understand what would follow. I sat there for a long time. My husband wasn't due home until the evening, and the house, for once, offered me no distractions. I had already cleaned the countertops the day before. The laundry sat folded in the basket by the stairs. Even the garden outside seemed to hold its breath, unwilling to rustle or bloom or grow. Eventually, I stood, rinsed the mug in the sink, and walked into the hallway. I passed the mirror without looking, as if to delay the inevitable moment of seeing my own face. Upstairs, his door was ajar, the bed made neatly. I paused at the threshold, half expecting something, a scent, a misplaced object, a message left behind, but the room was tidy, impersonal, quiet. The only thing left was the faint impression on the pillow, already softening into the fabric. I closed the door gently and descended the stairs again, each step creaking with the weight of reflection. Around midday, I drove into town, not because I needed anything, but because I needed the illusion of motion. I stopped at the small grocery store, wandered through the aisles without purpose, picked up a few items I didn't particularly need, milk, hand soap, fresh herbs, and waited in the checkout line behind a woman talking loudly on her phone about her daughter's recital. She turned and smiled at me politely, but her eyes moved past me quickly, as if I were a wall she'd already seen 1,000 times. That invisibility used to wound me. Today, I almost welcomed it. When I returned home, the kitchen was still just as I had left it. I unpacked the groceries with slow movements, pausing between each item, as if grounding myself in the familiar clatter of dishes and the feel of smooth surfaces beneath my palms. I placed the basil by the windowsill. I adjusted a crooked frame on the wall. I wiped the sink again, even though it was clean. The rhythm helped. I needed rhythm. But no amount of motion could silence the hum of everything unsaid. In the late afternoon, I found myself in the den, curled into the armchair by the bookshelf. I pulled a blanket over my legs even though it wasn't cold, and I stared at the spines of novels I had once loved but hadn't opened in years. I thought about the characters I used to lose myself in, the stories I used to collect like charms on a bracelet, each one a little window into a life more vivid than my own. It struck me how much I had stopped allowing myself to be moved by anything. And then the sound of the front door. It opened, closed again with its usual soft thud. I heard the rustle of a bag, the solid tap of shoes on tile. I didn't move right away. I just listened to my husband move through the entryway, hanging his coat, placing his keys in the small dish by the door. He entered the room a few moments later, carrying a small paper bag and smelling faintly of sawdust and car oil. He looked tired. Or maybe older. Or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time in a while. I picked up those hooks for the shed, he said, holding up the bag. And the grout you mentioned. I nodded. Thank you. He sat down in the other chair without removing his shoes. He rubbed his palms together, then rested them on his knees. He didn't look at me, not directly. Just somewhere near me. The silence stretched between us. And then, quietly, he asked, "Are you happy?" The question struck deeper than I was prepared for. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I did. I could have lied. I could have softened it. But something in his voice, in his posture, in the way his fingers fidgeted slightly against his leg, something told me he already knew. Maybe he had known for longer than I realized. No, I said, carefully, steadily. Not really. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the carpet. We sat like that for a while. Two people who had built a life together, now unsure how to inhabit it. Not with rage, not with betrayal, not even with blame, just an aching distance that neither of us had tried hard enough to bridge. I didn't want to ask before, he said. Because I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I looked at him then. Really looked. I didn't want to say it before, I answered. Because I was afraid it would make it real. We didn't cry. We didn't argue. There was no drama, no crescendo of voices. Just a low tide of truth washing gently over what remained. Eventually, he stood and walked toward the hallway. Before disappearing around the corner, he paused. There's someone else, isn't there? The question wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even an accusation. It was simply a fact spoken aloud, offered into the space like a coat left at the door. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to deny it. But because the silence said enough. He nodded again, slower this time, and walked away. The sound of his footsteps faded up the stairs. The door closed behind him, not loudly, not softly, just with finality. I remained in the chair, staring at the empty space he had left behind. And I breathed. Not in relief. Not in regret. Just with the quiet, steady rhythm of someone finally acknowledging the shape of their life. The day after that conversation passed in a muted haze, as though the walls of the house had absorbed our truths and now refused to echo anything back. I woke early, earlier than usual, but stayed in bed longer than I should have. The space beside me in the bed was still warm when I opened my eyes, which meant he hadn't gone far yet. But by the time I descended the stairs, he was gone. He left no note, no message, just his mug washed and turned upside down on the drying rack. There was something quiet in the way he'd gone, intentional, but not bitter. It reminded me of the way he used to exit conversations when we were younger, just stepping away when it felt like words had run out. It used to irritate me. Now, I almost admired the restraint. The house was still. Still in a way that felt not peaceful, but hollowed. Like a stage after the actors have left, props in place, lights dimmed, waiting for something to start again, though nothing will. I stood in the hallway and listened to the ticking of the old wall clock. A sound I had tuned out for years now seemed to pulse through the air like a metronome, measuring the seconds between then and now. There was no plan for the day. I had cleared my calendar without needing to say it aloud. There were no guests coming, no errands that couldn't wait, no meals that required preparation. I made a pot of tea, stood at the window watching the birds for a while, then went to the study. For years, that room had been a kind of storage of memory. Books, loose papers, framed photographs, and a drawer full of things I hadn't needed in decades but couldn't bring myself to throw away. I pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk and sat on the floor. My knees didn't bend as easily as they once had, but I didn't rush. Inside were old sketchbooks. I had studied art once. Not professionally, not in any way that earned degrees or praise, but passionately. In college, I used to sketch between classes, during lectures, even on napkins at coffee shops. But when we married, those sketchbooks were boxed up, one by one, until they were just a weight in the bottom drawer. I hadn't touched them in over 15 years. I pulled one out. The spine cracked softly, the pages still held the scent of graphite and old paper. The first image was of a bridge, arched, delicate, with trees lining its curve. I remembered sitting on the grass that day, just out of frame. I remembered the sound of passing footsteps, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. I remembered feeling alive in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing until now. One by one, I turned the pages. Faces. Hands. A lamp by the window. My own reflection in reverse. They weren't masterpieces. But they were mine. Expressions of who I had been before I became someone's wife, someone's stepmother, someone responsible. I gathered the sketchbooks into a cloth bag and carried them out to the car without thinking. The drive into the city was uneventful, an hour of trees blurring past, buildings rising slowly as I approached the center. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I didn't know who I would tell, even if I had. I found a small studio space on the edge of a quiet street. It was listed in the window, for rent. It was modest, just one room with wide windows and pale wooden floors. Dust still coated the corners, and a faint smell of old paint lingered in the air. But the light, it was beautiful. Clean and golden and honest. The door was unlocked. I stood just inside for a moment, letting the silence wash over me. And then, slowly, I pulled one of the sketchbooks from the bag, opened to a blank page, and sat on the floor. I didn't draw right away. My hand hovered over the page for several minutes. Then finally, slowly, deliberately, I began to sketch. I don't remember how long I stayed there. The world outside the windows shifted gently, people walking past unaware of the quiet return happening inside. I drew a hand first, my own, resting on a windowsill. Then a chair in shadow. Then a shape I didn't have words for yet, but it poured from me anyway. When I left, I felt different. Not healed. Not fixed. But aligned, as if something that had been tilted for years had found its rightful place again, even if only for a while. Back home, I placed the bag by the door and hung my keys on the hook. My husband was in the kitchen, making tea. He turned when he heard me come in but didn't speak immediately. He looked tired, but not angry. There was a quiet resignation in his shoulders. "I didn't know where you went," he said after a moment. "I needed air," I replied. He nodded. He didn't ask anything more. We both understood the space between what was said and what was felt. We were fluent in that kind of silence. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. The faucet dripped slowly. Outside, the sky was beginning to dim, casting long shadows through the windows. We stood there in the fading light, two people who had once shared everything and now shared only the acknowledgement that we no longer could. He finally broke the quiet. "I've been seeing someone," he said. He didn't look at me when he said it. Just stirred his tea as though he were discussing the weather. I didn't react. Not visibly. Something in me had known for a while. There had been signs, missed calls he didn't explain, sudden errands, a shift in his energy I couldn't name until now. I nodded once. I figured. He turned to face me then, his expression unreadable. "Does it change anything?" I thought about it. Then I said, "No. Not really." We stood like that for a few more seconds, two truths finally spoken out loud. Later, I sat alone on the porch, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the cool air brushing my skin like a reminder that the world kept moving, no matter what we chose. The stars began to appear one by one. Not bright, not dazzling, but steady. Somewhere inside the house, a door closed. And I let it.